In this video, we uncover the brutal murder of a man whose body has never been found. On July 31st, 2009, Jesse Richards was driving through the English countryside of Cleve Prior when a white Renault van forced him off the road. Inside were 7 men, armed with pickaxes and hammers, with pure intent to kill. They moved fast, forcing Richards out of the driver's seat before unleashing a barrage of blows to his head and body. His screams echoed through the quiet countryside as he begged for his life to be spared. But by then, it was too late. His lifeless body was bundled into the back of the Renault, and from that moment on, Richards was never seen again. The 41-year-old father from Surrey had been living a double life, a scrap metal dealer by day and a seasoned cannabis smuggler by night. But he'd crossed the wrong people and owed dangerous men dangerous money. The following morning, his burnt-out van was discovered in Bedworth. Inside, police found traces of his blood, but no body. In the years that followed, 5 men were convicted and handed a combined total of over 58 years in prison. Yet to this day, not one of them has ever revealed where Richards is buried. For more than 15 years, his mother has begged for answers, but none have ever come. This is the story of a debt that became a death sentence and a secret that someone, somewhere, is still keeping. Jesse Richards wasn't just a scrap metal dealer. That was the story he told his neighbors, the version his wife and their 3 children saw every morning before he left for work. But behind the legitimate business, behind the family man facade, Richards was running a far more dangerous operation. He was a career criminal, a cannabis smuggler who specialized in moving massive shipments from Holland into the UK. With a background in scrap metal, Richards and his associates used their trade to their advantage. They would weld together large metal containers, expertly sealing compartments designed to conceal blocks of cannabis resin. Shipments that slipped through customs completely undetected. For a time, the operation ran smoothly. The profits rolled in, and the network they'd built seemed untouchable. However, by late 2002, their luck ran out. Authorities intercepted a shipment worth over £5 million, exposing the sophisticated smuggling ring Richards had been orchestrating behind the scenes. He and his business partners were arrested and later convicted. Richards, labeled by prosecutors as the mastermind, was handed a 6-year prison sentence. Inside, he kept his head down, served his time quietly, and walked free in September 2005. Yet, they say old habits die hard, and for Richards, that couldn't have been truer. The moment he walked out of prison, he went straight back to doing what he knew best. He started reconnecting with old faces, building new links, and quietly re-establishing himself in the underworld. By early 2009, he'd formed a close partnership with Kevin Houston, a boxing promoter from Coventry, known as much for his violent temper as his ties to organized drug networks. Houston wasn't someone you crossed. He surrounded himself with loyal, unpredictable men, street soldiers who enforced his will without question. One of those men was James Doe, a name already etched in local police files. Doe was from the Coventry suburb of Earlsdon, and by then, he'd been on the run for nearly a decade after a 2001 burglary in Worcestershire, where he'd stolen antiques worth more than £30,000. He'd been granted bail, but never returned to face trial. He'd spent years drifting from one place to the next, staying low, keeping off the radar. Eventually, he found his footing in Coventry, where he moved in with his brother Joseph Doe, who was already deep in the drug trade. The group of men began working together, orchestrating deals, and each playing a critical role in the success of their operation. As a result, they reaped massive rewards and were close to being untouchable. But in early spring of 2009, things took a turn. Jesse Richards had apparently gone under difficult times, and his scrap metal business, which was his main source of income, had proven not to be profitable anymore. He was also under investigation by the HM Revenue and Customs, as his other business, a recycling company, was suspected to be involved in a £1.7 million VAT fraud scandal. However, the outcome of those allegations remains unknown. Desperate to get back on his feet and facing mounting financial pressure, Richards organised 2 separate smuggling runs, coordinating with his contacts in Holland to bring cannabis into the UK using money he borrowed from Kevin Houston and James Doe. These weren't small operations. They were substantial shipments that required significant upfront capital, the kind of money that Houston and Doe fronted with the expectation of a healthy return on their investment, and Richards assured them the runs would be successful. But out of sheer bad luck, customs intercepted the shipments. The product was seized before it ever reached British soil. The money was gone, lost to government evidence rooms and destroyed operations. Just like that, the father of three was now heavily indebted. Weeks passed, and Jesse Richards was living on borrowed time. Both Kevin Houston and James Doe were breathing down his neck, demanding their money back plus interest. Richards knew that if he didn't pay soon, there'd be consequences. His longtime friend, Jimmy Johnson, a boxing promoter known in certain circles as the King of the Gypsies, stepped in, hoping to calm things down. Johnson met with Doe at a pub in Stratford, trying to broker peace, to buy Richards some time. But it was no use. The tension was already too deep. In the days before the attack, Richards made one last move. He travelled to Holland, returning to the same country where he'd built his smuggling network years earlier. This time, he wasn't relying on old methods, or leaving anything to chance. He'd come up with a new technique called coopering. It was a sophisticated system where shipments were transferred mid-channel, from yachts to speedboats, allowing smugglers to bypass customs entirely by never officially docking at a port. Against all odds, it worked. Richards successfully brought in £1 million worth of cannabis resin, moving it across the channel undetected and back onto British soil. On July 31st, 2009, Jesse Richards made the long drive to Sheffield, transporting the cargo to a storage unit he'd recently rented. When an employee asked about the boxes, Richards brushed it off, saying they were just his personal belongings, that he and his wife were going through a divorce. It wasn't entirely a lie. Richards' personal life was in pieces. For nearly 2 years, he'd been having an affair with a woman from a traveler's site. The two spoke every day, and she later told police they were deeply in love, that Richards had promised to leave his wife Amy to start a new life with her. Their last meeting was on July 8th, and they'd planned to see each other again on August 1st. But that meeting would never happen. On his way back from Sheffield, Jesse Richards had a clear plan in mind: find a buyer, move the product, and settle his debt before things got any worse. If everything went smoothly, the weight that had been crushing him for months would finally be gone. But what Jesse didn't know was that someone was already watching him. For miles, a white Renault van had been trailing his vehicle, keeping its distance, but never letting him out of sight. Inside were 7 men, armed with pickaxes, hammers, and bats, each of them knowing exactly what they were there to do. As Richards approached Cleve Prior, a small village near Evesham, the van suddenly surged forward. Within seconds, it was on him. Forcing his vehicle off the road with surgical precision, crashing it into the bushes. Before he could react, the doors of the Renault burst open. The men swarmed out, surrounding his van. Richards was dragged from the driver's seat and thrown to the ground as a storm of blows rained down. The attack was brutal, methodical, every strike meant to make sure he didn't get back up. When it was over, the country road fell silent. Richards' body, lifeless and broken, was hauled into the back of the white van, and just like that, he was never seen again. 2 days after the attack, on August 2nd, Jesse Richards was reported missing by his estranged wife, Amy. She'd grown increasingly worried. Richards hadn't called his 3 children in days, something he did almost a dozen times a day. The following day, officers made a grim discovery. Richards' van was found abandoned in a car park on Parrots Grove, Bedworth, completely burnt out, reduced to a blackened shell of twisted metal. It was immediately clear that the fire hadn't been an accident, but even fire leaves behind secrets. Forensic teams combed through the wreckage and found traces of blood among the charred remains, confirmation that something violent had taken place. Yet, there was still no sign of Richards. Subsequently, an intense investigation was launched, pulling together every available resource as detectives worked to reconstruct Jesse Richards' final hours. Based on the timeline and the areas involved, investigators believed his body had been dumped somewhere in Warwickshire, but without a body, those were only educated guesses. When news of Richards' disappearance reached Jimmy Johnson, panic set in. He didn't wait for the police. He already had an idea of who might be responsible and where to start looking. Distraught but determined, Johnson tracked down David Butler, one of Kevin Houston's closest associates, and cornered him with questions about Richards' whereabouts. At first, Butler tried to deflect, but Johnson pressed harder, demanding the truth. Finally, Butler broke his silence. He told Johnson what he'd feared all along. Richards was indeed dead. However, Butler never revealed where his body had been hidden. That part of the story remained a mystery. Armed with the information Johnson provided, authorities quickly moved in. Within days, all 7 men connected to the attack were arrested and charged with the murder of Jesse Richards, despite the fact that his body was never found. Authorities continued the desperate search for Jesse Richards' body while working to build a watertight case against the suspects. Investigators dug up fields near Chesterton Windmill, just outside Harbury, following leads and local tips. But every effort ended in disappointment. With no body and little physical evidence, prosecutors were forced to make a difficult decision. They moved forward with the case, downgrading the charges from murder to manslaughter, a strategic move aimed at securing convictions rather than risking the men walking free. January 2012, almost 3 years after Jesse Richards' brutal murder, the trial finally began at Birmingham Crown Court. The courtroom was packed as the prosecution meticulously laid out their case, retracing Richards' final hours and the violence that ended his life. For more than 2 months, the jury listened to witness testimonies, phone records, and forensic evidence. Then, after 2.5 months of deliberation, the verdict was in. David Butler, Matthew Taylor, James Doe, Kevin Houston, the mastermind, and Joseph Doe were all found guilty of manslaughter, receiving a combined sentence of 58 years behind bars. The remaining 2 men, Martin Sutherland and Jonathan Calcott, were acquitted. There simply wasn't enough evidence to tie them to the crime. But even after justice was served in court, one haunting question remained. Where was Jesse Richards' body? It's been 16 years since Jesse Richards left home for what he called a business trip, and was never seen again. His killers have long since served their time and walked free, moving on with their lives as if nothing ever happened. But for Richards' mother, time has stood still. The pain of not being able to give her son a proper burial, of never being able to say goodbye, still haunts her to this day. Over the years, she's appeared on countless TV programs, offering a £10,000 reward for any information that could lead her to Richards' remains. However, Richards wasn't a saint. He was a man torn between 2 worlds, a loving father and a career criminal. In the end, it was greed that consumed him. He took one risk too many, owed the wrong people, and paid the ultimate price.